Lily, promise me you won't open this letter until 5 years have passed. Jason's voice trembled, and his eyes. I'll never forget how empty they looked, like he had already said his final goodbye. He held the envelope as if it were the most fragile thing in the world, his hands shaking slightly as he extended it toward me. What's in it, Jason? I asked, my voice edged with unease. His gaze darted away from mine, the shadow of a man who once seemed so confident. It's an explanation, he whispered. Just promise me. I nodded, unsure if I was agreeing out of trust or fear. Something in the air between us felt wrong, heavier than it had ever been. Jason's demeanor over the past weeks had been distant, distracted. But this was something else. The next morning, Jason was dead. The police called it an accident, but I knew better. That letter, the one I was holding in my trembling hands, had answers. I could feel it. For hours, I sat in my room, staring at it. The words "don't open yet" written in Jason's sharp handwriting stared back at me. What could possibly be inside that made him so desperate? What kind of truth was he so afraid I'd find too soon? Jason had always been a complicated man. He married my mom when I was 16, stepping into our lives with a confidence that masked something deeper. At first, he seemed like the perfect partner, charming, attentive, endlessly supportive of her dreams. But when it came to me, things were different. The compliments started early. "You're growing into a beautiful young woman, Lily," he'd say, his eyes lingering a little too long. At first, I chalked it up to awkward fatherly attempts at connection. After all, he wasn't my real dad. Maybe he just didn't know how to interact with me. But then it escalated. The way he touched my shoulder lingered. The way his eyes trailed over me became impossible to ignore. One day, he stopped me in the hallway, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You remind me so much of your mother when she was younger," he said softly. His voice sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, brushing it off, but inside, something felt wrong. When I told my mom about it, she just laughed. "Jason adores you," she said dismissively. "Don't be silly." I started to doubt myself. Was I imagining it? Overreacting? But the looks, the lingering moments, they never stopped. One night, when Mom was out of town, Jason and I were alone in the house. "Let's have dinner together," he said, his tone light but his eyes heavy. "Just the two of us. A little quality time." I hesitated. Spending time with him felt suffocating, but I couldn't think of an excuse fast enough. At the table, he poured me a glass of wine, something he'd never done before. "You're old enough for a little celebration," he said with a smile. I sipped it hesitantly, the bitter taste filling my mouth. Halfway through dinner, his compliments grew bolder. "You're stunning, Lily. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were trying to turn some heads." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. My heart pounded as his words hung in the air. I think I'm going to bed," I stammered, pushing my chair back. But he stood up too, his chair scraping against the floor. "Lily, wait. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, stepping toward me. His hand brushed against mine, and I pulled away. "Good night, Jason," I said firmly, retreating to my room and locking the door. In the weeks that followed, Jason's behavior grew stranger. He avoided me, barely speaking unless it was unavoidable. The once confident man seemed hollowed out, consumed by something invisible. Then came the letter. I couldn't stop thinking about his last words to me, "Just promise." His voice echoed in my mind as I sat in my room, staring at the sealed envelope. The weight of it was unbearable, like the truth inside was screaming to be let out. I knew opening it meant breaking my promise. But I also knew Jason wasn't coming back, and the answers were right there in my hands. Should I wait 5 years? Could I even wait 5 minutes? The clock ticked loudly in the silence of my room. My fingers trembled as I traced the edges of the envelope, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. This letter would change everything, I was sure of it. And what came next would be even harder to face. Jason entered our lives when I was 18. At first glance, he seemed like the perfect man for my mom, successful, charismatic, and endlessly supportive. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly win everyone over. And for a while, I believed we were lucky to have him. But soon, I started to notice something off. His attention to me didn't feel normal. It began with innocent-seeming compliments. "Lily, you're becoming a real beauty," he said one day, smiling warmly. I laughed it off, brushing the comment aside. After all, wasn't it normal for a stepfather to acknowledge his stepdaughter's growth? But the compliments didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more pointed. He'd comment on my clothes, my hair, even the way I walked. "That dress really suits you," he'd say, his eyes lingering a little too long. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting. Yet, his gaze became harder to ignore. No matter where I was or what I was doing, I could feel him watching me. Even when he wasn't saying anything, his presence felt heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Things escalated one evening when Mom went out of town for a work trip. Jason and I were alone in the house. "Let's watch a movie together," he suggested casually. There was nothing strange about the offer, on the surface. But something in his tone made me hesitate. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound normal. He set up the movie in the living room, dimming the lights. I chose a seat at the far end of the couch, but he sat closer than I expected, just a little too close. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. Halfway through the movie, he broke the silence. "You know, you remind me so much of your mother when she was younger," he said softly. The way he said it made my skin crawl. His voice was calm, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore. "Thanks," I muttered, focusing on the screen. But Jason wasn't done. "You've got her grace, her confidence, even her smile," he continued. His eyes weren't on the TV, they were on me. I didn't know how to respond. My stomach churned as I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "You're growing up so fast, Lily. It's hard to believe you're already 17, he said with a wistful smile. That was it. I couldn't sit there any longer. "I think I'm going to bed," I said abruptly, standing up. "Oh, don't go," Jason said quickly, reaching out to touch my arm. His fingers brushed my skin, and I froze for a moment before pulling away. "Good night, Jason," I said firmly, walking away as quickly as I could. Once in my room, I locked the door and sat on my bed, my heart pounding. Something was definitely wrong, but I couldn't figure out what to do about it. Mom wouldn't believe me, she was too smitten with him. And confronting Jason directly? That felt impossible. Over the next few weeks, I started avoiding him. I'd leave the room when he entered, keep conversations as short as possible, and find excuses to stay out of the house. But Jason wasn't oblivious. "You've been distant lately, Lily," he said one morning, cornering me in the kitchen. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "Did I do something to upset you?" "No, not at all," I lied, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. "I'm just busy with school." But Jason wasn't satisfied. That evening, he knocked on my bedroom door. "Lily, can we talk?" he asked. "I'm tired, Jason." "Maybe tomorrow," I replied through the closed door. "Please, just for a minute," he insisted. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Finally, I opened the door just enough to look at him. "What is it?" I asked. I feel like we're not as close as we used to be," he said, his voice soft, almost sad. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course." But even as I said the words, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Jason wasn't just trying to be a supportive stepfather. His attention wasn't innocent, it never had been. One day, when Mom was out running errands, Jason caught me in the hallway. "Lily," he called out, stopping me in my tracks. "Can I ask you something?" I turned to face him, my heart racing. "What is it?" "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different?" he asked, his voice low. "Different how?" I replied cautiously. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "I mean, if we weren't tied by labels like stepfather and stepdaughter." My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say, what to think. Jason's words echoed in my mind, their implications clearer than I wanted to admit. "I don't know what you mean," I said quickly, stepping back. Jason smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't match the expression. "Never mind." Forget I said anything. From that moment on, I couldn't look at him the same way. Every interaction felt loaded, every word he said felt like it carried a hidden meaning. I started spending more time at friends' houses, avoiding home as much as I could. But Jason didn't stop. If anything, he became more persistent, finding excuses to be near me, to talk to me. One evening, while I was studying in my room, he knocked again. "Lily, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice unusually serious. I didn't answer. My pulse raced as I stared at the door, willing him to go away. "Please," he said. "It's important." I sighed and opened the door, keeping the chain lock in place. "What is it, Jason?" He looked at me through the small gap, his expression unreadable. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. At the time, I didn't understand what he was apologizing for. But now, sitting with his letter in my hands, it all started to make sense. Jason had been carrying something dark, something he couldn't escape. And I was at the center of it. The answers were in that letter, I was sure of it. But was I ready to face them? What happens next will change everything. Stay tuned, because the truth inside that letter, it's more shocking than you could ever imagine. Jason became bolder with each passing day. His touches seemed casual, almost fatherly on the surface, but I knew better. A hand on my shoulder, fingers brushing my hair, always lingering just a second too long. One afternoon, as I was trying on a new dress for an event, he appeared in the doorway. I froze, startled by his presence. "That looks nice," he said, his voice calm but his eyes sharp as they traveled the length of me. "But you should try something more fitted. It'd really show off your figure." His words made my skin crawl, but I forced a laugh, muttering something about how this dress would have to do. Jason didn't press further, but the way he looked at me, it left me feeling exposed. Later that evening, I told my mom. "Jason's been acting strange around me," I said hesitantly. She smiled dismissively, barely looking up from her laptop. "Oh, Lily, don't be silly. Jason adores you. He's just trying to bond with you." Her words left me feeling helpless. If my own mother couldn't see what was happening, who else could I turn to? The tension grew unbearable. Jason always seemed to be there, watching, finding excuses to interact with me. It didn't matter if I was cooking, studying, or simply walking through the house, he was always close by, his presence suffocating. One evening, when Mom was away for work again, Jason knocked on my bedroom door. "Lily, can I come in?" he asked softly. I hesitated, my heart racing. "What do you need?" I replied through the door, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," he said, his tone gentle. Reluctantly, I opened the door a crack. Jason stood there with a faint smile, holding a cup of tea. "I thought this might help you relax," he said, handing it to me. "Thanks," I muttered, taking the cup but keeping the door mostly shut. "You've been so tense lately," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "I just want you to know you can talk to me about anything." "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Good night, Jason." I closed the door before he could say anything else, locking it immediately. My hands shook as I placed the tea on my desk, untouched. Days turned into weeks, and Jason's behavior became more invasive. He'd comment on what I was wearing, asking where I bought certain outfits, or suggest what he thought might look good on me. "You've got such a great figure, Lily. You should show it off more," he'd say casually, as if it were a normal thing for a stepfather to mention. I started wearing baggy clothes around the house, hoping it would make him stop. But Jason always found a way to make me feel uncomfortable. One weekend, while Mom was out running errands, Jason suggested we reorganize the attic together. "It's a mess up there, and I could use an extra set of hands," he said with a grin. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it was better than being alone with him in the living room. As we sorted through boxes, I noticed him watching me out of the corner of my eye. Every time I bent down to pick something up, I felt his gaze. "You work hard, Lily," he said suddenly, his voice warm. "You've got such a good energy about you." "Thanks," I replied, keeping my focus on the task at hand. But when I turned around, he was standing closer than before. Too close. "You know, it's nice spending time with you," he said, his voice low. "We don't do this enough." I stepped back instinctively, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's been fun. I think we've made good progress here." Jason's expression darkened for a moment, but he quickly covered it with a chuckle. "You're right. Let's call it a day." That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moments in the attic, his comments, his proximity. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge. The next morning, Jason knocked on my door again. This time, I didn't answer. "Lily, I just wanted to check in," he called out. "You've been so quiet lately." I stayed silent, my heart pounding. After a moment, I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. It wasn't just his presence that unnerved me, it was the fact that he was so good at hiding it from everyone else. Around my mom, he was the picture of a perfect husband, charming and attentive. But when we were alone, it was like he became a different person. One evening, I overheard Jason and Mom talking in the kitchen. "She's been avoiding me," Jason said, his voice soft but filled with concern. "I think she's upset about something, but she won't talk to me." "Teenagers can be moody," Mom replied lightly. "Give her some space." Jason sighed dramatically. "I just want to make sure she's okay. I care about her, you know." His words made my stomach churn. I knew exactly what kind of care he was talking about. Later that night, he knocked on my door again. "Lily, I just want to apologize if I've done anything to upset you," he said through the door. "I hope you know how much I value you." His words felt like a trap, but I forced myself to respond. "Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. I thought things couldn't get worse, but I was wrong." One night, Jason entered my room uninvited. "I saw your light on and thought you might need someone to talk to," he said, his voice gentle but his presence overwhelming. "I'm fine," I said firmly, standing up to face him. "Lily, He trailed off, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "I want you to know how special you are to me." I froze, my mind racing for an escape. "Thanks, Jason, but I really need to sleep now." He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Good night." As he left, I locked the door behind him, my hands trembling. Jason's actions weren't just crossing boundaries, they were shattering them. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince anyone else to see it. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, and Jason was always there, always watching. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever, but I didn't know how to break free. And all the while, that letter sat in my drawer, a silent reminder that the truth about Jason was far more complicated and far more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. I started avoiding Jason entirely, retreating to my room whenever I heard him nearby. But no matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, he always seemed to find a reason to be around. His demeanor remained calm, his words kind, but his smile, it no longer felt genuine. It was as if he was hiding something behind it, something even he couldn't control. A few days before it all happened, Jason's behavior shifted. He became quieter, his movements slower, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for him. One evening at dinner, he broke the silence with a cryptic comment. "I wish things could have been different," he said, staring at his plate. I froze, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked hesitantly. He shook his head, his lips pressing into a tight line. "Don't worry about it. Just forget I said anything." The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of weight that made every second feel like an eternity. Mom didn't seem to notice. She was busy talking about her upcoming business trip, completely unaware of the tension between Jason and me. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my mind. What was he trying to tell me? Why did he seem so defeated? The next morning, Jason looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. He muttered a quick goodbye before leaving for work, avoiding eye contact as he walked out the door. By the time he returned that evening, his energy was different. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something darker. He barely spoke during dinner, only nodding occasionally when Mom asked him questions. Later that night, I heard him pacing in the hallway outside my room. Back and forth, the sound of his footsteps keeping me awake. I wanted to open the door, to ask what was wrong, but fear kept me rooted in place. Jason's final night was eerily quiet. I stayed in my room, pretending to sleep, but I could hear faint noises from the living room, the clinking of a glass, the creak of the floorboards as he moved around. It wasn't unusual for him to stay up late, but something about this night felt different. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my mom screaming. I ran downstairs to find her in the living room, tears streaming down her face. Jason was gone. He had taken his life, though no one said those words out loud. Instead, they called it an unfortunate incident, leaving the truth unspoken but impossible to ignore. The police arrived quickly, their voices hushed as they spoke to my mom. I stood in the doorway, numb, unable to process what was happening. The Jason I had known, complicated, overbearing, and deeply flawed, was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt both suffocating and heavy with unanswered questions. Mom kept repeating the same thing over and over. It was an accident. It was just an accident. But I knew better. I had seen the signs, heard the weight in his voice during those final days. Jason had made a choice. In the days that followed, the house felt emptier than ever. Mom threw herself into planning the memorial, avoiding any conversation about what had happened. But for me, the weight of his actions was inescapable. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter he'd given me. It sat in my desk drawer, untouched, but its presence was a constant reminder that Jason's story wasn't over. What had he wanted me to know? Why had he asked me to wait 5 years? And most importantly, what secrets had he been carrying that were too much for him to bear? The letter held the answers, but I wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. I spent hours replaying our last conversations in my mind, dissecting every word he'd said, every glance he'd given. His comment at dinner, "I wish things could have been different," felt like a riddle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. As much as I tried to push it aside, I couldn't escape the truth. Jason's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a culmination of everything that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The letter was a key, but opening it would mean confronting the darkest parts of his life, and ours. I couldn't wait any longer. The letter had been haunting me since the moment Jason handed it to me. My fingers trembled as I held it, my heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, I tore open the envelope. Inside were a few pages, Jason's handwriting shaky and uneven, as though he had written them in the middle of a storm. "Lily, I need to say what I never had the courage to tell you face to face. I'm sorry. For everything." I knew I was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop myself. I froze, the words blurring on the page as my chest tightened. "You were never to blame. It was me, my brokenness, my weakness. I've been carrying this weight for years, and I've only dragged you and your mom down with me. I can't live with it anymore." His confession was both shocking and unsurprising. I read on, each word cutting deeper than the last. I hoped I could fix things, that I could change. But every day, it got harder to hide what I felt, and I knew I'd ruin you if I stayed. "Please forgive me, Lily. I failed you. I failed her." I dropped the letter, my breath catching in my throat. Anger, relief, confusion, they all hit me at once. Jason had been carrying his demons all this time, but instead of facing them, he let them consume him. Now, I was left to pick up the pieces. I thought back to that final night. The quiet clinking of a glass, the sound of him pacing. When they found him, he'd left no room for doubt about his choice. The empty bottle of pills, the note addressed to Mom, it all made sense now. Jason's death wasn't an accident, no matter how much Mom tried to convince herself otherwise. I reread the letter, trying to find something, anything, that would give me closure. But all it did was confirm what I already knew. Jason was a broken man who had pulled me into his chaos. He was apologizing, yes, but his words didn't erase the damage he'd done. For hours, I sat with that letter, the weight of its truth pressing down on me. Every memory of Jason, the way he watched me, the things he said, came rushing back, sharper and more painful than ever. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter into pieces, to forget he ever existed. But I couldn't. His actions, his words, his choices, they were now a part of me, whether I liked it or not. Jason's letter wasn't just an apology. It was a final act of selfishness, a way to leave me with the burden he couldn't carry anymore. "I can't believe he wrote this," I whispered to myself, staring at the pages scattered across my bed. But at the same time, I could. It was exactly like him to leave without giving me a choice, to make his pain my responsibility. I stood up, gathering the letter and its envelope. For a moment, I considered burning it, letting the ashes drift away like the man who wrote it. But something stopped me. Instead, I locked it in a drawer, along with the memories of Jason that I wasn't ready to confront yet. This wasn't closure, not yet. But it was a start. Jason may have taken his truth with him, but he didn't take my future. I wouldn't let him. This letter wasn't the end for me, it was the beginning of something new. If you've ever been through something you couldn't share with anyone, let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts.